The afternoon of April 10th, 1834 began, with the kind of deceptive calm that only New Orleans could conjure. The French Quarter lay heavy under a sun that made the iron balconies shimmer and the magnolia blossoms release their perfume into the thick, humid air. It was spring, and the city pulsed with its usual contradictions, beauty and rot, laughter and dread, life and death all woven together in the streets. On Royal Street, the mansion at number 1140 stood as a monument to wealth and refinement, its walls hiding secrets no passerby could have imagined. That day, smoke began curling from its windows, rising above the quarter like a signal of doom. Neighbors rushed forward, not out of suspicion, but of instinct, assuming the family within needed rescuing. Fire in the quarter was always a terror, its wooden structures ready to ignite in chain reaction. But as the people gathered, as the fire brigade pushed through the doors and climbed the stairs, the blaze itself ceased to be the danger. What they found would sear itself into memory far more deeply than flames ever could. When the firemen broke down the attic door, expecting perhaps frightened children or valuables to save, they stepped into a chamber that stripped the veil from New Orleans' glittering façade. 7 human beings were chained in grotesque positions, their bodies mutilated, bearing scars of systematic torture. Iron collars dug into skin, limbs stretched beyond recognition, faces hollowed by both hunger and pain. It was not the wreckage of fire they saw, but the wreckage of souls. And the architect of this chamber of horrors was not some faceless villain from the shadows, but a woman of silk and reputation, a lady welcomed at balls, praised at church, admired in salons. Madame Delphine LaLaurie, pillar of Creole society, respected hostess. Charitable donor had been revealed in one instant as something monstrous. That day shattered illusions, burned away excuses, and forced a reckoning. Evil had not lurked in some alley. It had sat at the dinner tables of the elite, and the people of New Orleans would learn, too late, how power and cruelty, when protected by wealth and status, could hide in plain sight for years until a fire tore down the disguise. To understand how the horrors of 1140 Royal Street came to exist, we must go back to the beginning, to the world that shaped Delphine McCarty into the woman who would one day become synonymous with cruelty. She was born around 1787 into one of New Orleans' most prominent Creole families, a household where refinement and brutality lived side by side as if they were natural companions. Her father, Bartholomew Louis McCarty, was of Irish descent but had carved out his place among the Creole aristocracy, while her mother, Marégienne Labo, carried the weight of French lineage and social prestige. From her earliest days, Delphine lived in a world where owning human beings was not just accepted but expected. The Spanish still ruled Louisiana when she was a child, and under their authority the city pulsed with contradictions. Catholic piety mixed with decadence, refined French manners fused with a constant undercurrent of violence, and, above all, the institution of slavery embedded into the bones of daily life. In this world, young Delphine would have been taught the graces required of a lady: music, dance, conversation, the art of managing a household. But managing in New Orleans meant controlling enslaved people, treating human beings as assets to be directed, punished, or discarded. By the time she could play the harp and recite poetry, she had also absorbed a darker lesson that the measure of status was not only wealth and family connections, but how thoroughly one commanded those who labored under them. These seeds of cruelty were sown long before she grew into womanhood, watered by a society that normalized domination. New Orleans at the turn of the 19th century was unlike any other American city. French, Spanish, and American influences mingled in its streets, creating a culture that was proud, insular, and obsessed with appearances. Balls and soirees displayed elegance, but beneath the chandeliers were whispers of scandal, cruelty, and corruption. In this glittering world, Delphine learned to wear a mask. She grew into a beauty who attracted the attention of wealthy suitors, a young woman destined not just to marry but to anchor herself in the very center of Creole society. At 19, she married her first husband, Don Ramon de Lopez y Angulo, a Spanish officer sent to the colony. It was a union of convenience, cementing ties between families and empires. And it offered her an education in what power and independence could feel like. For Delphine, the arrangement was the beginning of something larger than marriage. It was the first taste of control. Delphine's first marriage was brief, yet it altered the trajectory of her life in ways few could see at the time. Don Ramon was older, seasoned in the ways of politics and colonial authority, and for Delphine, barely out of girlhood. The union was less about romance and more about securing her position within the shifting sands of New Orleans society. In 1804, while traveling to Spain, Don Ramon fell ill and died, leaving Delphine a widow at only 21. For most women of her class, widowhood meant vulnerability, but for Delphine, it became a strange form of liberation. Suddenly, she controlled property, money, and most importantly, the enslaved people left behind in her household. In a world where women were often relegated to dependence, she tasted independence, and the flavor was intoxicating. Neighbors whispered that even during this first chapter, signs of her cruelty emerged. Servants in her home were unusually silent, their fear palpable. There were murmurs of harsh treatment, strange punishments that went beyond the norms of even a slaveholding society. Nothing could be proven, but the shadows around her household grew longer. In 1808, she married again, this time to Jean Blanc, a wealthy banker, lawyer, and politician who was well connected in Louisiana's elite circles. With him, she bore 4 children, and on the surface, the household looked like the picture of prosperity and refinement. Yet, beneath the veneer, something darker was festering. Enslaved people began to vanish from the Blanc household. Those who remained carried wounds and terror in their eyes. Whispers circulated that punishments in that home were excessive, cruel even by the standards of the age. When Jean Blanc died in 1816, Delphine once again found herself widowed this time, with even greater property and influence at her disposal. 2 husbands gone, both leaving her with wealth, connections, and a household of enslaved people under her sole control. The pattern was emerging. Each loss, each shift in her life, seemed to strip away restraints. Each time she stood more independently. The cruelty deepened. Freedom for her meant domination over others, and the taste of unchecked authority only hardened her appetite. New Orleans society, dazzled by her beauty and refinement, chose not to see. In the ballrooms, she was admired. In church, she was pious. And in her home, the screams of the enslaved were muffled by walls that society preferred not to peer behind. It was during these years that Delphine perfected her dual existence, one life of grace and charity, the other of terror and control. By the time Delphine entered her 3rd marriage, she had already established herself as one of the most striking figures in the French Quarter. Her beauty was still spoken of with admiration, her manners impeccable, her lineage unassailable. To the outside world, she appeared the embodiment of Creole refinement, but within her home, the enslaved whispered of a different Delphine, a woman whose smile concealed cruelty sharpened with each passing year. In 1825, she married Dr. Leonard Louis Nicholas LaLaurie, a physician recently arrived from France. He was younger than her, less wealthy, and far less respected within Creole society. Many believed the marriage was born of convenience for him, and of restless ambition for her. To Delphine, Leonard was not so much a partner as another piece of her carefully crafted image, a doctor husband who lent her household an air of modern science and civility. Yet their union was troubled from the beginning. Leonard was known for his temper, for financial troubles, and for quarreling with his wife in public, a scandalous break from the polished composure Creole society demanded. But whatever flaws Leonard carried, Delphine retained control of the household, and by 1831 she purchased the Grand Mansion at 1140 Royal Street. It was to be her masterpiece, a home that announced her status not just as wealthy but as untouchable. The 3-story mansion gleamed with stuccoed walls, arched windows, and Castillon balconies, commanding attention from all who passed by. Inside, its parlors hosted glittering soirees where musicians played and chandeliers lit the laughter of the city's elite. Guests drank, danced, and admired their hostess, never suspecting what awaited behind the upper doors. Yet the enslaved, who labored within those walls, bore the truth. They carried wounds both visible and invisible, and whispers spread through the neighborhood that Delphine's punishments were merciless. Some claimed she starved them, chained them in hidden chambers, or beat them into silence. Others said she relished inventing new forms of torment. When officials investigated after reports of mistreatment, Delphine's charm shielded her. She smiled, denied everything, and society let the matter drop. After all, who could believe such cruelty? Of a woman so refined, so charitable, so graceful. To doubt her was to question the very fabric of Creole society itself. And so the mask held, even as the house at 1140 Royal Street grew darker. Even as its halls echoed with secrets no ball or salon could ever drown. The whispers around Royal Street became harder to ignore as the years went on. Servants vanished suddenly, their absence explained away with casual lies that they had been sold, that they had run off, that they had been sent back to family plantations. But neighbors noticed the patterns. They saw the fear etched on the faces of those who remained, the trembling hands that delivered trays, the cautious steps that echoed through the marble halls. On more than one occasion, local officials intervened after reports of cruelty surfaced. In 1828, a court ordered Delphine to forfeit several enslaved individuals after evidence of mistreatment emerged. For most women of her stature, such a ruling would have been a devastating blow to reputation. But Delphine's beauty and charm carried her through the scandal. With the help of her influential relatives, the enslaved were quietly transferred back into her household under the names of different family members, and the matter was forgotten by polite society. This pattern of exposure, denial, and forgiveness created a dangerous shield that allowed her brutality to deepen unchecked. Her husband, Dr. LaLaurie, grew increasingly estranged, frustrated by both her temper and her obsession with control. Their arguments spilled into public view, shouted exchanges on balconies, slammed doors heard in the street below. Yet even their turmoil became part of the city's gossip, woven into the mystique of the household. Behind closed doors, however, the truth was far darker. Survivors whispered of a hidden chamber in the attic, a place where screams were muffled by thick walls and no guest was ever permitted entry. Chains, iron collars, and cruel instruments of restraint were rumored to lie within. Whether or not these early stories were exaggerated hardly mattered. The sense of unease surrounding the LaLaurie Mansion grew heavier, and neighbors crossed the street to avoid its shadow. The house became both a spectacle and a warning, a place where elegance and horror lived side by side. And still, Delphine entertained, smiling sweetly, draped in silk, her mask of gentility never slipping as she raised a glass to her guests. In that balance of beauty and terror, the legend of the LaLaurie Mansion was already being born, though no one yet realized how violently it would erupt. The defining moment came on the morning of April 10th, 1834, when fire broke out at 1140 Royal Street. The blaze began in the kitchen, thick smoke curling into the sky and drawing crowds from across the French Quarter. Neighbors rushed to help, fearing the destruction of one of the district's finest homes. But as they forced their way inside, the fire revealed more than scorched plaster and smoke-stained ceilings. In the chaos, rescuers stumbled upon locked doors upstairs, barred shut despite the flames spreading. When they broke them open, the scene inside stunned even hardened men of New Orleans. Shackled to the walls were enslaved men and women in a state of unimaginable suffering. Reports varied, but all spoke of emaciated bodies, open wounds, and instruments of restraint that spoke of prolonged torment. Some were chained by the neck, others bound in unnatural positions. The smell of blood, an infection mixed with the smoke, and even the most composed onlookers recoiled in horror. The fire, intended by its origin to be an escape, had instead become revelation. Word spread through the streets like the flames themselves. A crowd gathered, their whispers swelling into shouts of rage. For years they had ignored the rumors, had allowed charm and wealth to blind them to cruelty, but now the truth stood before them in iron chains and hollow eyes. when Delphine LaLaurie appeared, pleading innocence, insisting she was a victim of malicious gossip, the crowd no longer listened. Stones were thrown, curses hurled, and vengeance ignited. As the fire consumed parts of the house, so too did the fury of the people consume the illusion of her respectability. What had been whispers became screams, and the city that once adored her turned against her in a single, violent tide. That night, 1140 Royal Street ceased to be a mansion of elegance and became something else entirely, a house of horror, a wound on the city's conscience that would never fully heal. As the fire died down and smoke drifted above the quarter, the mob outside the LaLaurie Mansion swelled into chaos. Men and women, outraged by what they had seen or heard, surged against the gates, breaking windows, storming through the ruined halls, and tearing apart the household that had once dazzled them. Furniture was smashed, mirrors shattered, portraits ripped from the walls, as if destroying the trappings of wealth could erase the memory of what had been uncovered. The slaves rescued from the attic were carried out into the street, their injuries laid bare for all to see, a grotesque testimony against the woman who had claimed refinement and civility. Some limped with broken bones, others bore scars that spoke of years of cruelty, and the crowd recoiled in shock before exploding with rage. Cries of monster and murderess echoed off the French Quarter walls. But in the middle of this chaos, Delphine LaLaurie herself had vanished. Accounts differ on how she escaped. Some claimed she slipped away through a carriage waiting in a side alley, her coachman whipping the horses through the mob as stones clattered against the wheels. Others believed she was smuggled out under disguise, aided by relatives determined to shield the family name from further disgrace. Whatever the truth, by the time the sun rose over New Orleans, the most infamous woman in the city was gone, leaving only her wrecked mansion behind. For days afterward, the mob returned, tearing the ruins further, spitting curses at the house itself as if its walls had been complicit. The building stood gutted, its windows gaping like hollow eyes, a scar in the heart of the quarter. Rumors spread quickly. Some said she had fled to Mobile, others that she had boarded a ship to France. There were even whispers she hid in New Orleans itself, cloaked in secrecy, watching as the city raged. But the truth remained uncertain, and in that uncertainty her legend grew. The woman who had once been the belle of Royal Street was now a phantom, her name spoken with a mix of horror and fascination. Her story already mutating into folklore even before her footprints had cooled. After her disappearance, New Orleans buzzed with speculation, each rumor darker than the last. Some swore they had seen her boarding a schooner bound for Mobile. Others claimed she had been spirited away by powerful friends who wanted the scandal. Buried in taverns and marketplaces, whispers said she had slipped into the French countryside under an assumed name, living out her years in hidden luxury, while others believed justice had caught up with her and she died nameless in exile. The truth was murkier. Contemporary accounts, like those of writer Harriet Martineau, suggested Delphine fled by carriage to the waterfront and sailed for Alabama before ultimately reaching Paris. What is certain is that by the time Martineau visited the gutted mansion in 1836, it remained a ruin, its windows gaping and walls blackened, as if the very house bore witness to its mistress's sins. For the city, her absence was both a relief and a frustration. The mob had wanted justice, yet she had evaded them, slipping through their grasp like smoke. Courts never tried her, and officials, wary of her family's influence, allowed the matter to fade. In the silence that followed, the enslaved who had survived her cruelty were left nameless, their suffering acknowledged only in fragments of testimony passed through the press. Meanwhile, Delphine herself carved out a life of quiet exile in Paris, surrounded by her mother and sisters, as though nothing had ever happened. Letters from her son revealed she longed to return to New Orleans, claiming she never understood why she had been forced to leave. Whether this was a lie she told herself, or evidence of a mind capable of erasing its own guilt, is impossible to know. But it was enough to deepen her infamy. For the citizens of New Orleans, her escape was proof that wealth and bloodlines could shield even the cruelest from retribution. For the world beyond, her story became something else entirely. A cautionary tale of elegance corrupted, a legend of horror that stretched across oceans. And so, though she walked the streets of Paris, her shadow still haunted Royal Street. Ghost without a grave, a woman whose crimes refused to die with her. Life in exile did little to soften Delphine's iron will. In Paris, she lived with her mother and two sisters, Pauline and Laure, attempting to rebuild a sense of normalcy while the weight of her crimes smoldered an ocean away. To her children, she wrote letters filled with longing for New Orleans, insisting she had been misunderstood, her reputation unfairly blackened by malicious tongues. In one surviving letter from her son Paul in blank to his brother-in-law, he wrote of his mother's determination to return home, saying she had thought about it for a long time and could not understand why her family opposed her. He described her as being in a constant bad mood, as if the very idea of exile gnawed at her spirit. Yet those closest to her refused to welcome her back. They feared the wrath of the city, the mob that had nearly torn her to pieces, the scandal that would reignite if her face was seen again on Royal Street. And so, despite her protests, she remained in France, caged not by iron but by the disapproval of her kin. What is most chilling is that, by all accounts, Delphine never acknowledged the reasons for her banishment. She seemed genuinely perplexed, as though the screams from her attic had never existed, as though her cruelty were nothing more than a rumor conjured by jealous rivals. This denial, whether born of madness, arrogance, or a chilling lack of conscience, only deepened the legend that surrounded her. In Parisian salons, whispers followed her, for news of her infamy had crossed the Atlantic, and even in exile she was a figure of morbid fascination. Some claimed she wandered the boulevards veiled, avoiding stares. Others said she carried herself with the same haughty pride she had in New Orleans, convinced she was the victim of injustice. To the enslaved she had left broken behind her. Such blindness was the final cruelty and erasure of their suffering in the mind of the woman who inflicted it. She had fled the fire, but she had not fled herself, and in that contradiction the seeds of her enduring myth took root. The mystery of Delphine LaLaurie's death only added fuel to her legend. In the decades after her flight, conflicting stories emerged, each one more unsettling than the last. Some claimed she died quietly. In Paris, in 1842, her body lowered into foreign soil without ceremony, her name barely whispered among the living. A copper plate later found in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 in New Orleans seemed to confirm this version, its inscription reading that Madame LaLaurie had died in Paris on December 7, 1842. Yet others insisted she survived years longer, living in denial and bitterness until 1849, when French records suggest she finally succumbed at the age of 62. The confusion around the dates left space for darker rumors to take root. One account, spread in the late 19th century, told that she had perished in a hunting accident, gored by a wild boar, her end as violent as the lives she had destroyed. Though no evidence supported it, the tale lingered, for it seemed fitting that such a life should end in savagery. What remained certain was this: she never returned to New Orleans, never faced trial, and never heard judgment from those whose lives she had broken. Instead, her absence became her presence. The cracked copper plate, discovered decades later by a cemetery sexton, seemed almost symbolic, like the fractured memory of a woman whose crimes could not be cleanly buried. Her name, etched in metal but riddled with uncertainty, carried an eerie permanence. Even in death, she eluded clarity, as if her legacy itself resisted closure. To some she was a monster who escaped justice, to others a tragic figure undone by her own arrogance. But to the city of New Orleans, she became something more, a ghostly stain that refused to fade. A reminder that cruelty left unpunished always lingers, festering in silence until it reshapes itself into legend. And so Delphine LaLaurie's death, whether in 1842 or 1849, was less an ending than a doorway, opening her story to myth, speculation, and the restless hunger of folklore. The house she left behind refused to die with her. The Royal Street Mansion, sacked by the mob in 1834, stood for years as a hollow carcass, its windows shattered, its walls blackened with soot, a scar at the heart of New Orleans. By 1838, it was rebuilt, not by LaLaurie, but by others who sought to erase the memory of what had taken place within. Yet memory has a way of bleeding through plaster and brick, and no amount of carpentry could wash away the screams embedded in its bones. Over the decades, it became many things: a school, a music conservatory, a boarding house, a bar, even a furniture store. But none of these roles settled comfortably on it. Students claimed to hear footsteps on the stair when no one was there. Tenants spoke of whispers in the dark, and drunks swore they saw figures peering from windows long after closing. It was a place that seemed cursed to shift, to never hold one identity for long, as though the walls themselves resisted peace. By the 20th century, the LaLaurie Mansion had cemented its reputation as one of the most haunted structures in the French Quarter. Tourists stopped to gawk, locals crossed the street rather than pass beneath its shadow, and storytellers made it a centerpiece in the dark folklore of the city. When actor Nicolas Cage purchased it in 2007, he admitted openly that he wanted a property steeped in legend, though by 2009 financial misfortune stripped it from his hands. Today, under new ownership, it remains closed to the public, its facade pristine yet impenetrable. Visitors can only stand outside, staring at its shuttered windows, imagining what once lived and died within. To look upon it is to feel the weight of history pressing close, reminding all who pass that buildings, like people, can carry the memory of cruelty, and that sometimes stone and would remember better than flesh. As the years passed, the mansion's story grew darker with every retelling. What had once been whispered accounts of chained servants and neglected captives soon morphed into nightmarish visions of sadistic torture chambers. By the mid-century, writers like Jean Delavigne embellished the horrors with grotesque detail, painting Madame LaLaurie not merely as a cruel mistress, but as a ravenous sadist, reveling in suffering beyond imagination. Her book, Ghost Stories of Old New Orleans, told of enslaved men with their eyes gouged out, women mutilated until their bodies resembled something less than human, intestines pulled out and wrapped like belts. Later, storytellers added still more gruesome images: a human caterpillar made of amputated limbs, a human crab twisted from broken bones, reset at wrong angles. None of these accounts were grounded in the original 1834 reports, but they spread nonetheless, carried by ghost tours, folklore collections, and the hunger of audiences who wanted horror sharper than history could provide. Fact blurred with fiction, but in that blur, LaLaurie's image hardened into something monstrous. She was no longer a wealthy Creole widow who abused her slaves. She became an icon of pure cruelty, a New Orleans Bathory, the embodiment of aristocratic evil cloaked in silks and jewels. To skeptics, these tales were exaggerations born from sensationalism, meant to sell books and lure tourists into shadowed alleys. To believers, they were revelations of truth, too terrible for the newspapers of 1834 to print. Either way, the legend fed on itself, swelling until it was impossible to separate the woman from the myth. And perhaps that was the point, for in folklore, the truth matters less than the lesson. The LaLaurie Mansion became not just a haunted house, but a warning carved into the fabric of New Orleans, that beneath the masks of refinement, unimaginable cruelty can live, and that the dead do not rest easily when justice has been denied. By the late 19th century, the LaLaurie Mansion was firmly established as one of the darkest landmarks of the French Quarter, a place where history and nightmare collided. Writers like George Washington Cable drew upon contemporary newspaper accounts but laced them with dialogue and speculation, giving the stories dramatic weight and ensuring their survival in the city's cultural memory. Henry Castellanos added his own retellings, weaving LaLaurie into the oral traditions that spread from taverns to street corners. With each generation, the house ceased to be merely a building and became a symbol, a kind of scar tissue on the map of New Orleans. Even as immigrants poured into the city and the face of the French Quarter shifted, the tale of the cruel Madame LaLaurie endured, whispered to newcomers as both entertainment and cautionary tale. The horror was amplified by the physical presence of the mansion itself. Its towering façade, wrought iron balconies, and shuttered windows seemed to radiate menace. Those who walked by claimed they felt watched, and more than one person swore they saw figures peering down at them, vanishing when confronted. By the 1920s and 1930s, ghost stories attached themselves to the house like barnacles to a ship's hull. Tenants reported strange noises in the night, chains dragging, moans echoing from empty rooms, sudden cold winds that cut through locked doors. Some believed the cries of the tortured enslaved still lingered in the walls, their suffering echoing endlessly in a place that never gave them peace. Others insisted Madame LaLaurie herself had returned, pacing her ruined mansion in fury, restless and unrepentant. The blending of historical cruelty with spectral imagery ensured that the mansion would never fade into obscurity. It was no longer just a relic of slavery, it was a theater of haunting. A living story that bound together the city's fascination with decadence, decay, and the spirits that history leaves behind. By the mid-20th century, the LaLaurie Mansion's reputation had reached beyond New Orleans, carried in books, magazines, and even whispered in radio broadcasts that relished tales of the macabre. Tourists came to the French Quarter not only for jazz and Creole cuisine, but to stand in the shadow of what was called the most haunted house in America. The legend grew as tenants continued to report unsettling experiences. A man who attempted to convert the property into apartments in the 1940s abandoned the project after claiming tools vanished. Walls dripped with unexplainable moisture, and workers fled in terror from disembodied screams. In the 1960s, a bar operated briefly on the ground floor, but customers often bolted after swearing they felt icy hands brush their necks or heard sobbing when the room was empty. One patron even swore he saw a pale figure in a ball gown gliding silently across the barroom before dissolving into the wall. The mansion became a magnet for occult groups, thrill seekers, and amateur ghost hunters, each leaving behind more stories, more fragments of fear that blurred the line between history and superstition. Yet beneath the ghostly theatrics, the true story remained heavier than any supernatural tale. This was not a house built on imagined evil, but on very real suffering, very real cruelty. Each ghost story, no matter how exaggerated, pointed back to the same foundation: human beings, chained, mutilated, and forgotten. In this way, the mansion served as both tourist spectacle and historical wound, where New Orleans indulged its appetite for the bizarre while being quietly reminded of the violence that lay at the core of its past. By the late 20th century, the LaLaurie Mansion had transformed from a decaying relic of the French Quarter into one of its most infamous tourist attractions, not because it opened its doors, but because of what it symbolized. Guides led visitors past the property with lanterns in hand, their voices carrying into the humid night, as they retold the horrors uncovered in 1834. Each retelling layered the legend with new embellishments, stories of headless apparitions wandering the halls, of phantom screams rising at midnight, of enslaved spirits whose chains still rattled in protest against an eternity of captivity. The house became a pilgrimage site for seekers of the grotesque, those drawn to the seductive pull of history's darkest corners. For locals, the mansion had always been a place of dread. Many refused to walk too close, claiming the air itself felt heavy, charged with something oppressive. Taxi drivers hesitated to drop passengers directly at its door, and children grew up with whispered warnings to avoid even glancing too long at its shuttered windows. Yet curiosity was irresistible, and the legend spread further with each generation. Ghost tours used the mansion as their crown jewel, crafting elaborate narratives that blurred fact and folklore, and in doing so, they ensured the name Delphine LaLaurie would never fade. Writers and filmmakers, too, found fertile ground in the story. The figure of Madame LaLaurie appeared in novels, short stories, and eventually television series, often exaggerated into a monstrous caricature, yet always tied back to the atrocities she committed. The mansion became both stage and symbol, a physical reminder of how evil can disguise itself in silk and refinement, while hiding its true face in locked rooms. But as the legends grew more theatrical, scholars and historians reminded the public that behind the ghostly tales lay real human suffering. 7 enslaved people had been found alive but brutalized in 1834. Many others had disappeared before them, their fates likely just as grim. Each scream that tour guides claimed to hear in the night was rooted in actual anguish once endured within those walls. The ghost stories, in their own way, served as a distorted memory, ensuring the crimes of Delphine LaLaurie were never entirely erased by polite society's desire to forget. The mansion's continued existence forced New Orleans to confront its own history of wealth built upon human pain, its own complicity in maintaining silence while horrors unfolded in plain sight. By the dawn of the 21st century, the LaLaurie Mansion stood not only as an architectural landmark, but as a cultural obsession. Its legend carried across the globe by books, documentaries, and the swelling industry of paranormal entertainment. The rise of ghost hunting television shows and online forums brought new attention, with self-proclaimed investigators begging for entry to capture evidence of the spirits said to remain trapped within its walls. The mansion, with its towering façade and shuttered windows, photographed beautifully against the dim gaslight of the French Quarter. And those images circulated widely, cementing its reputation as one of the most haunted locations in America. Yet, despite the attention, the interior remained largely inaccessible. Owners came and went, some private, some public figures, each drawn to the mystique of the property, only to sell after a short time. Rumors whispered that the building itself resisted habitation, that no one could comfortably live in a house built upon torment. In 2007, when actor Nicolas Cage purchased the property, newspapers buzzed with fascination. He too would later lose it, joking that perhaps the house was cursed. But the deeper truth was far less glamorous. The mansion represented a wound, not just for those who suffered there, but for the city that still wrestled with the legacies of slavery, racial violence, and economic disparity. Every tourist who snapped a photo, every guide who retold the tale, was participating in a strange exchange between memory and entertainment, pain and profit. The ghost stories sold tickets, but the real history was often softened, trimmed, or obscured to fit the expectations of those who wanted a thrill without the discomfort of reckoning with systemic cruelty. Yet the building would not let its truth die quietly. Historians continued to research the lives of the enslaved who suffered there, piecing together fragments of records, names, and oral traditions. They sought to remind the world that behind the haunting tales lay human beings who had endured unimaginable abuse, whose voices were silenced not just by Delphine LaLaurie, but by the society that allowed her to thrive. In this way, the mansion became less a house of ghosts than a mirror, reflecting back the darkness of human nature, the hunger for spectacle, and the dangerous ease with which cruelty is forgotten when disguised in luxury. It stood, and still stands, as a warning, a reminder that evil does not vanish when the doors are locked, that history's wounds echo until they are fully acknowledged. The LaLaurie Mansion today is more than just brick and mortar, more than plaster walls and iron balconies. It is a monument to contradiction. By daylight, it looks like any other grand residence of the French Quarter, its clean lines and muted grey façade blending with the elegance of the district. Tourists pass by with cameras, snapping photos of its symmetrical windows, noting its beauty but also pausing to whisper about the horrors that unfolded behind those walls. At night, however, the mansion changes character. Its looming presence becomes heavier, as though the air thickens around it, and its windows seem less like openings for light and more like watchful eyes, unblinking, filled with accusation. Guides linger outside with groups of wide-eyed travelers, recounting the infamous fire of 1834, the screams that poured into the streets, and the broken bodies discovered in the attic. Listeners shiver not just from the night air, but from the weight of the tale, from the sudden realization that beneath the French Quarter's charm lies a history steeped in blood. Some claim to see faces flickering in the glass, others swear. They hear faint cries or the dragging of chains as they pass. Whether these are tricks of imagination or something more is irrelevant. The legend has carved itself into the cultural memory of New Orleans so deeply that the line between story and reality no longer matters. For the city, the mansion represents both the lucrative allure of haunted tourism and the unresolved trauma of its past. It is a house that generates revenue, a place where fear is marketed nightly. Yet, it is also a house that holds the memory of suffering that cannot be monetized without unease. Scholars argue that the mansion should be remembered, not as a ghost story but as a site of atrocity, a place to confront the cruelty of slavery head. But for many, the macabre fascination outweighs the uncomfortable truth. This tension between spectacle and remembrance defines the LaLaurie Mansion today. It is not simply haunted by spirits, but by history itself, history that refuses to be buried no matter how many layers of legend are added on top. Standing before it, one cannot help but wonder, are the chills that creep along the spine caused by restless ghosts, or by the recognition of what humanity is capable of when cruelty goes unchecked? Perhaps the mansion is not haunted by the dead at all, but by the conscience of the living. To stand before the LaLaurie Mansion is to confront the uncomfortable truth of how society chooses to remember evil. The story of Delphine LaLaurie has long been wrapped in a veil of myth, her name spoken with the same shiver reserved for fictional villains, her house branded as a carnival of horrors for the curious. Yet the tragedy lies not only in the acts themselves, but in how they have been consumed, distorted, and repackaged over nearly 2 centuries. Tour guides weave her atrocities into entertainment, presenting her alongside ghost stories of pirates, voodoo queens, and restless spirits. Television shows dramatize her life, often reducing the enslaved victims to nameless shadows, while focusing instead on the sensational cruelty of the mistress herself. In doing so, the narrative continues, the very silencing that began in her attic. The voices of those who suffered most remain faint, while the woman who inflicted the pain becomes infamous. This imbalance reveals something unsettling about human fascination. We are quick to remember monsters, to give them names, faces, and endless retellings, yet the true humanity of their victims fades into obscurity. In New Orleans, the enslaved people who lived and died in that house were stripped first of freedom, then of dignity, and finally of memory. They are remembered collectively as the tortured, not as individuals with families, hopes, and lives stolen. Only fragments of their existence survive in scattered documents and whispered oral histories. And still, their suffering fuels ghost tours, novels, and horror stories that rarely grant them the justice of recognition. The mansion itself becomes complicit in this forgetting, standing proudly on Royal Street, its balconies and walls admired more for their architecture than for the crimes they sheltered. And yet, within that contradiction lies a haunting more powerful than any phantom, the haunting of a nation's history, of cruelty that was not the work of one deranged woman, but of a system that allowed her to thrive. For Delphine was not an anomaly. She was a reflection of a society that treated human lives as property, that turned a blind eye so long as wealth and status were preserved. To confront the LaLaurie Mansion honestly is to confront not only her sins, but the collective silence of neighbors, officials, and an entire culture that permitted her cruelty until it was exposed by fire. It is not just her house that is haunted. It is our memory, our conscience, our history that refuses to rest. The legend of Delphine LaLaurie cannot be separated from the city that birthed it. For New Orleans itself is a city built on contradictions, beauty and brutality, celebration and sorrow, freedom and bondage. In the early 19th century, the city was the crown jewel of the American South, a place where fortunes were made in sugar, cotton, and the slave trade. Behind the opulence of its Creole mansions, however, was a constant reality of human suffering. The LaLaurie story is, in truth, an extreme reflection of this society. Her cruelty shocked the public not because violence against the enslaved was rare, but because her actions exceeded the unspoken boundaries of acceptable brutality. Her neighbors owned human beings too, disciplined them with whips, and worked them until exhaustion, but LaLaurie's torture was sadistic, unnecessary, and impossible to disguise. This is why the 1834 fire became such a turning point. It forced a society that had long lived in denial to look at the grotesque truth without the usual mask of polite distance. And yet, even in outrage, there was hypocrisy. The mob that tore through her home was not rallying for abolition or human rights. They were expressing disgust that such horrors had been committed so openly, damaging the city's carefully curated facade of refinement. In this way, LaLaurie became a scapegoat, the embodiment of evil onto which a guilty society could project its shame while continuing the very system that enabled her. After her exile, New Orleans carried on with slavery for decades, profiting from the same cruelty that had been exposed in her attic. Thus, the haunted legacy of the LaLaurie Mansion is not merely about one woman's monstrosity, but about a culture's willingness to ignore atrocities until they became too grotesque to conceal. When tourists gather before the mansion today, they are unknowingly staring into this duality, the house as a symbol of individual cruelty, but also as a mirror reflecting the broader violence of a society that built its wealth on chains. The ghosts said to wander its halls are not just the tortured souls of LaLaurie's victims, but the unquiet spirits of a nation still wrestling with its original sins. The true haunting is not supernatural, it is historical, ethical, and deeply human, echoing through every retelling of her story. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the LaLaurie Mansion had already taken root as a permanent fixture in the folklore of New Orleans. The house was no longer simply a ruin rebuilt after fire, nor merely a stately building on Royal Street. It had become a symbol, a shorthand for cruelty, decadence, and restless spirits. Travel writers arriving in the French Quarter recorded hushed accounts of ghostly moans drifting from its shuttered windows at night. Neighbors claimed they saw figures pacing the balconies in the moonlight, silhouettes dressed in rags that vanished when approached. A cobbler who lived nearby swore he often heard the metallic sound of chains dragging across stone. Though the courtyard below was empty, these stories circulated through a city already steeped in tales of voodoo, pirates, and spirits that walked after death, and the mansion quickly earned its title as the most haunted house in New Orleans. Yet this growing mythology was not simply born of fear, it was a form of storytelling that allowed the people of the city to grapple with the horrors that history had left behind. New Orleans was a city of celebration, its music and festivals, designed to transmute sorrow into rhythm, suffering into ritual. In the LaLaurie legend, the grotesque realities of slavery and violence were alchemized into ghost stories, easier to share with strangers than the unvarnished truth of systemic cruelty. This transformation, however, came with consequences. The enslaved victims, whose lives ended in unimaginable torment, became nameless characters in a Gothic narrative, remembered more as restless spirits than as human beings. Their pain was converted into spectacle, their silence twisted into eerie whispers in the dark. For some, the legend became a warning, a reminder that cruelty leaves echoes that refuse to fade. For others, it was mere entertainment, a tale to chill tourists walking through the quarter at night. And so the house lived on in memory, less as a site of historical atrocity and more as a theater of fear. But beneath the stories, the building carried a weight that could not be erased. It was a monument not to phantoms but to the real horrors inflicted within its walls. Every scream reported by passers-by, every flickering light glimpsed through a window, was in truth a reflection of the city's own unease, its inability to bury the past it had built itself upon. The modern fascination with the LaLaurie Mansion reveals more about us than it does about Delphine herself. In an age where horror is packaged as entertainment, her story has been recycled into novels, documentaries, and television dramas, each layering new exaggerations upon an already grotesque truth. Writers in the mid-20th century embellished her cruelty to levels that defied biology, inventing stories of dismemberments and mutilations so monstrous they blurred into the realm of the supernatural. By the late 1990s, ghost tours operators were selling her legend nightly, guiding crowds through the French Quarter with lanterns in hand, reciting tales of eyeballs gouged, brains stirred with sticks, and bodies twisted into unholy shapes. These accounts, though almost entirely unsourced, resonated with audiences eager to be shocked. But the danger of such stories is that they transform real human suffering into fantasy, erasing the dignity of those who endured it. The victims of LaLaurie did not die as props for ghost stories. They were enslaved men and women whose agony has been lost beneath centuries of embellishment. Yet paradoxically, it is this very sensationalism that has ensured the story's survival. Without the grotesque exaggerations, perhaps the memory of the LaLaurie Mansion would have faded into a footnote of history. Instead, it persists, not as a sober account of cruelty, but as a living legend that straddles the line between truth and myth. The house has become a stage where history, folklore, and commerce collide. Tourists pay to be frightened, storytellers profit from horror, and New Orleans itself markets the legend as part of its identity, a city where the dead never rest, where shadows whisper down cobblestone streets. And yet, within this carnival of the macabre, there remains a question that refuses to be silenced. Why are we so drawn to monsters like LaLaurie? Perhaps because, by staring at her cruelty, we can reassure ourselves that evil is the work of individuals, singular and extraordinary, rather than systems we live within every day. It is easier to condemn one woman than to confront the society that allowed her to exist, the culture that normalized chains and whips, the neighbors who looked away until fire forced their hand. Thus, the LaLaurie Mansion is not just haunted by spirits, it is haunted by us, by the way we remember, by the stories we choose to tell, and by the truths we bury beneath entertainment. To understand the endurance of the LaLaurie legend, one must look at the architecture of fear itself. Fear is not sustained by a single story, but by repetition, by the layering of whispers, until they form a tapestry that clings to a place like ivy to stone. The LaLaurie Mansion embodies this perfectly. Over time, each generation has added its own embroidery to the narrative. 19th century neighbors spoke of screams and chains. 20th century writers embellished with grotesque mutilations. Modern ghost tours invent ever darker details to keep audiences hooked. The house has become less a home and more a canvas upon which collective anxieties are painted. What is striking is how the physical building feeds this myth. Its stern façade of grey stucco, its rotting balconies that cast long shadows at dusk, its looming height above the neighboring houses, all of this provides a stage set so perfect for horror that it hardly needs a story at all. When passers-by looked at its shuttered windows, they do not see empty glass. They see the possibility of faces peering out, of eyes that no longer belong to the living. Architecture becomes psychology, and psychology becomes folklore. But beneath the layers of invention lies the truth that makes the legend unshakable. Real suffering happened here. Unlike purely fictional haunted houses, the LaLaurie Mansion sits on blood-soaked soil, a place where human agony left an imprint too deep for time to erase. That truth anchors the myth, giving it weight, making the legends harder to dismiss. And so the house exists at the crossroads of history and nightmare. It is at once a tourist attraction and a memorial, a ghost story and a crime scene, a place where fact and fiction are braided so tightly that few can tell them apart. Yet perhaps that blurring is the true haunting, not the moans in the night, not the shadows on the balcony, but the way we have allowed myth to replace memory, spectacle to replace justice. The enslaved people who died within those walls do not need to haunt the mansion for their presence to be felt. It is their erasure that echoes most loudly. Each time the story is told without their names, their humanity slips further into silence, leaving only the architecture of fear behind. The LaLaurie Mansion is often described as a place cursed by history, but the curse is not supernatural, it is moral. To stand before its iron gates today is to confront the weight of human cruelty and the ways society chooses to mask it. For all the whispers of ghosts, for all the tales of chains rattling in the night, the true horror is that an entire community allowed the torture of men, women, and children to continue in silence until fire ripped away the veil. This silence is the mansion's deepest haunting. Neighbors surely heard cries, surely noticed the gaunt figures that slipped through its courtyards, yet few acted until the brutality became undeniable. Their complicity was not born of ignorance, but of convenience, a willingness to look away, in order to preserve the elegance of the quarter. That willingness still echoes today, though in a different form. Tourists come seeking chills, laughing nervously as guides describe horrors in theatrical tones, their fears softened by the safety of performance. The story becomes an evening's diversion rather than a confrontation with atrocity. In this way, the mansion has been converted from a site of suffering into an industry of entertainment, profiting from pain long after the screams have died. And yet, there are moments when the façade cracks, when even the most casual listener feels a tremor of unease, not because of the ghosts, but because of the realization that the story is not a legend at all, but a fragment of a brutal truth. The haunted reputation serves as a kind of camouflage, distracting from the real wound beneath. It is easier to believe the house is haunted than to face the reality that humans are capable of such cruelty without any need for the supernatural. Easier to imagine tortured souls drifting through its corridors than to accept that the real ghosts are historical, the legacy of slavery, the persistence of racial trauma, the long shadow of silence and denial. That is the curse of the LaLaurie Mansion. Not that it harbors restless spirits, but that it forces us, if only briefly, to confront the monsters that were real, the monsters that lived behind elegant facades and were tolerated by polite society. It is not the dead who haunt us. It is our memory, our avoidance, our refusal to look directly into the past. By the mid to late 19th century, the LaLaurie Mansion had already begun its transformation from a site of scandal into a site of legend. The burned-out shell of the house lingered for years, a blackened reminder of what had been discovered within, but also an open canvas upon which rumor and exaggeration could be painted. The people of New Orleans, a city steeped in folklore, Catholic ritual, and Caribbean mysticism, found in the mansion a story too potent to ignore. It was said that strange noises echoed from its gutted walls, cries of agony that seemed to come from nowhere. Others claimed to see shadowy figures moving along its balconies, fleeting glimpses of gaunt shapes with chains rattling at their feet. These whispers turned into stories, and the stories into lore, until the mansion became known less as a ruin and more as a haunted site. Newspapers occasionally revisited the story, fueling public imagination with tales of secret burials, hidden chambers, and unmarked graves beneath the courtyard. Many of these claims were impossible to prove, yet they gave the house a new life, one not dependent on truth, but on fear. Visitors came not to mourn the dead, but to thrill themselves with the possibility of encountering them. The city itself seemed complicit in this transformation, for New Orleans has always thrived on a delicate blend of beauty and darkness, of revelry and ruin. Ghost stories became part of the city's currency, and none shone brighter or darker than that of Madame LaLaurie. As decades passed, writers like George Washington Cable and Henry Castellanos recorded and embellished the tale, cementing it in popular imagination. Their works blurred fact and fiction, making the horrors both more sensational and more distant, turning real suffering into literary spectacle. By the time the 20th century arrived, the LaLaurie Mansion was no longer simply a ruin but a stage for the supernatural, an attraction in a city eager to market its mysteries. Yet beneath every embellishment lay a kernel of truth, a reminder that the legend's foundation was not fantasy but atrocity. What had been done within those walls required no ghost to chill the blood. Still, for many, it was easier to dress the past in ghostly garments than to stare unflinching at the human cruelty that birthed it. Thus, the mansion's haunted reputation grew, not as a warning, but as a distraction, a story palatable enough to be retold by candlelight, while the unspoken truth lingered in the shadows. As the LaLaurie Mansion moved into the 20th century, it carried with it not just whispers of cruelty, but the weight of a reputation that would never fade. The house stood tall in the French Quarter, its iron-laced balconies and looming façade, casting long shadows onto Royal Street, attracting those who craved both beauty and fear. By this time, the real history had begun to dissolve into a haze of embellished retellings. Writers and storytellers competed to craft the most shocking versions of what had been discovered in the attic, feeding a growing appetite for horror. Jean de Levin's mid-century work injected a new level of grotesque detail, describing mutilations so lurid that they bordered on the theatrical. It did not matter that her accounts lacked evidence. The public wanted stories of flesh and bones shattered, of eyes gouged and mouths sewn shut. Truth had become secondary to sensation, and the mansion, once a site of mourning, became a monument to macabre entertainment. The building itself changed hands repeatedly, serving as everything from apartments to a school, yet it never shed its aura. Tenants reported unease, claiming footsteps echoed in empty halls. Doors slammed without cause, and spectral figures drifted across staircases, whether fueled by imagination or something deeper. These reports fed the mansion's reputation as the most haunted house in New Orleans. Tourists, drawn to the city's intoxicating mixture of music, decadence, and death, were eager to believe. By the 1920s and 1930s, the mansion was firmly woven into the city's folklore, its image etched into postcards and its name whispered on nighttime tours. New Orleans had learned to market darkness, and the LaLaurie Mansion was its crown jewel. But as the legends swelled, the deeper moral truth was buried further beneath the rubble of spectacle. What began as a story of cruelty inflicted upon enslaved human beings had become an almost mythological horror tale, detached from the reality of systemic brutality and racial trauma. The people who suffered in that attic had been erased twice, by their mistress's violence, then by history's willingness to turn them into characters in a ghost story. Yet the house remained, as if unwilling to let its past vanish completely, its windows dark, its halls cold, a silent witness to how memory itself can be twisted into entertainment, while the true victims are forgotten. By the mid-20th century, the LaLaurie Mansion was less a home and more a stage where history and myth performed together in uneasy harmony. Writers, paranormal investigators, and thrill-seeking visitors swarmed to Royal Street, each one hoping to peel back another layer of its dark reputation. But what they found was not clarity, only further blurring of lines between fact and invention. The attic where enslaved men and women had been chained and tortured was now painted with stories of spirits rattling chains, shrieks echoing at midnight, and shadows crawling along the walls. Tour guides embroidered these tales with new details, describing Madame LaLaurie herself wandering the halls in a blood-stained gown, forever searching for her victims. These dramatizations thrilled visitors, but they also revealed something unsettling about the way people consume history. The mansion had become a carnival mirror, distorted, exaggerated, terrifying, yet still recognizable. Behind every story of a phantom scream was the real scream of a human being that history had chosen to romanticize rather than reckon with. This transformation reflected not just New Orleans' relationship with its past, but America's broader struggle with memory. It was easier for the public to embrace ghosts than to confront the systemic brutality of slavery. Easier to imagine supernatural punishment than to examine the cultural silence that allowed such atrocities to occur. At the same time, the mansion itself resisted being reduced to mere spectacle. Every brick seemed to carry a vibration of unease. Residents who dared to live there often left abruptly, claiming a suffocating presence lingered in the upper floors. Some reported hearing the shuffle of feet in rooms thought empty, or whispers rising from the basement at night. Others simply felt watched, an oppressive awareness pressing down upon them. Whether these phenomena were real or born of suggestion hardly mattered. The mansion had become an active participant in its own mythology. It no longer belonged to the LaLaurie family, or even to the city itself. It belonged to history's shadows. And yet, for all the sensationalism, fragments of truth managed to seep through. The survivors of Delphine's cruelty, though nameless, in most accounts, were never completely silenced. Their suffering echoed in the building's reputation, ensuring that no one could ever think of 1140 Royal Street without also thinking of bondage, pain, and the terrifying mask of civility that had concealed it for so long. As the 20th century waned and the 21st began, the LaLaurie Mansion became one of the most visited and most spoken of landmarks in New Orleans, not because of its architecture or its historic preservation, but because of the darkness that clung to its walls like a second skin. Ghost tours made it a centerpiece of their nightly excursions, drawing crowds who walk through the French Quarter under flickering lantern light, listening to guides recount tales of screams, chains, and apparitions pacing the attic halls. Tourists came seeking thrills, but what they often found was something deeper, strange heaviness in the air, as though the walls themselves exhaled sorrow. The mansion's ownership passed through many hands, some drawn by its fame, others undone by the weight of its reputation. Businesses tried to operate from within its rooms, but employees whispered of doors opening on their own, icy drafts sweeping through hallways, and the persistent feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Some residents fled after only days, claiming the mansion was not a house at all, but a trap of memory that refused to release them. At the same time, scholars and historians began working to reclaim the truth buried beneath the ghost stories. They pointed out that the sensationalized versions of Madame LaLaurie's crimes bones shattered beyond recognition. Grotesque experiments, and mutilations too gruesome to describe, were exaggerations born from later retellings. But even when stripped of embellishment, the reality was still horrific enough. Enslaved men and women tortured in secret, their humanity erased by a woman who smiled in church pews and hosted elegant parties for the city's elite. This tension between myth and fact gave the mansion its power. It was both a haunted house and a crime scene, a place where tourists shivered in excitement while historians shuddered in grief. Its legend drew strength from contradiction, the respectable façade hiding monstrous deeds, the wealthy hostess cloaking the soul of a tormentor, the ghost stories layered atop the very real cries of human suffering. By the 2000s, Hollywood too was drawn into the mansion's orbit, with films, documentaries, and even popular television series casting Madame LaLaurie as both villain and phantom. She had become an archetype, a symbol of evil hidden in plain sight, a reminder that the worst monsters often wear silk gloves and speak with refined grace. Yet beneath the drama and the supernatural, the true weight of the mansion remained the same. It stood as an eternal witness to human cruelty and society's dangerous ability to look away in the present day. The LaLaurie Mansion sits behind its rattan gates like a sleeping predator, its shuttered windows watching silently over Royal Street as though it is aware of the weight of eyes always fixed upon it. Visitors stop daily to photograph the pale grey façade, some whispering prayers, others daring one another to touch the stone walls, as if by contact they might absorb some fragment of the building's cursed energy. Though privately owned and closed to the public, the mansion exerts a gravitational pull stronger than any open attraction nearby. Tourists flock to its perimeter as though compelled by an unseen force, the very absence of access only heightening its mystique. Guides still tell their chilling stories at dusk, their voices echoing through the quarter, describing how screams are said to rise from the attic on humid nights, or how the ghost of a young enslaved girl, Leah, who once leaped to her death, to escape Madame's whip, has been seen darting across rooftops. But what strikes the attentive visitor is not the fantasy of phantoms, but the undeniable aura of oppression that lingers. Standing before the mansion, one feels a stillness, heavy and electric, as if the past itself refuses to dissolve into history. That past demands recognition, and in recent years, a new layer of dialogue has emerged. One that shifts focus away from Madame LaLaurie and onto the silenced voices of the enslaved. Historians, activists, and descendants have argued that the mansion must not remain merely a tourist attraction or ghost story prop, but a living reminder of the atrocities of slavery. In this way, the house continues to serve as a contested space, part carnival sideshow, part memorial. Its ownership adds another chapter to its story. Celebrities like actor Nicolas Cage briefly possessed it, drawn by its legend only to lose it quickly, as though the house itself rejects long-term inhabitants. Even wealth and fame cannot dissolve the weight it carries. The mansion exists as a paradox, beautiful yet horrific, preserved yet corrupted, silent yet screaming. It embodies the duality of New Orleans itself, a city where joy and sorrow intertwine, where music rises from streets built on suffering, and where the dead are never fully gone. In every whispered rumor, in every flash of a camera, in every tremor of unease that visitors confess to feeling, the LaLaurie Mansion reasserts its truth. It is more than haunted. It is history refusing to be forgotten, a scar carved into the city's soul that continues to throb with memory and warning. The legacy of the LaLaurie Mansion has now transcended brick, mortar, and ghostly rumor to become a cultural archetype, a story retold in books, documentaries, podcasts, and films, always hovering between the factual and the fantastical. Madame LaLaurie herself has become a symbol of hidden cruelty, the kind of evil that thrives behind silk curtains and chandeliers, where elegance masks barbarity. Some depictions render her as a demonic figure, a caricature of sadism meant to terrify, while others approach her as a tragic emblem of society's corruption. A woman elevated by privilege who chose to exploit rather than protect. Yet in all retellings, the enslaved remain the true heart of the narrative. Their suffering, once buried beneath whispers and sensational headlines, now insists on recognition. Modern voices ask, who were they? What were their names, their stories, their dreams stolen away in the shadowed rooms of the mansion? It is here where the mansion's story takes on its deepest meaning. It is not merely a haunted house, it is a ledger of forgotten lives. Each tourist who shudders at the thought of chains rattling in the attic participates in an uncomfortable paradox, delighting in fear while standing on the site of genuine horror. This tension raises questions about memory itself. How do societies remember atrocities? Do they disguise them as ghost stories, palatable for popular consumption? Do they reduce them to legends, so the terror can be experienced safely, like a thrill ride, rather than acknowledged as systemic cruelty woven into history? The LaLaurie Mansion offers no easy answers. Instead, it forces confrontation. To look upon its walls is to see both the allure of mystery and the weight of injustice. Some argue it should be transformed into a museum dedicated to slavery, an act of historical redress, while others insist its curse lies in never allowing peace, in remaining locked and inaccessible, a reminder too volatile to domesticate. What remains undeniable is the mansion's immortality in the human imagination. It has survived fire, scandal, rumor, and even commodification, yet it continues to breathe as a story told and retold. The French Quarter teems with music, revelry, and light, but at 1140 Royal Street the shadows linger, whispering a different kind of truth. It is the truth of how beauty can conceal horror, how privilege can breed monstrosity, and how memory refuses to rest when injustice remains unresolved. The LaLaurie Mansion stands not only as New Orleans' most infamous house, but as a mirror reflecting humanity's darkest capabilities. The LaLaurie Mansion, in the end, is not only a relic of New Orleans history, but a monument to the duality of human nature itself, the brilliance of art, culture, and architecture, contrasted with the savagery of cruelty and unchecked power. Its story persists because it embodies questions that have never been answered. How much darkness can hide within refinement? And how often does society choose to look away until the secrets force themselves into the open? For nearly 2 centuries, visitors have walked past its iron balconies, staring up at shuttered windows, feeling a heaviness in the air that cannot be explained away by architecture alone. Some whisper that they hear the faint clank of chains, the low groans of those once confined, or the anguished cries of people long denied justice. Others insist it is merely suggestion, that the power of the mansion lies not in literal hauntings, but in the stories that linger in collective memory. Either way, the weight of history clings to its walls like a second skin. To the city, it is a paradoxical treasure and attraction that brings fascination, tourism, and profit, while simultaneously carrying the responsibility of remembering the enslaved men, women, and children who suffered there. For scholars, it remains a tangle of fact and myth, a reminder that history often survives in fragments, distorted by rumor, embellished by folklore, yet never entirely erased. For the public, it is a story of horror that must be reckoned with not because of supernatural tales, but because of the real human cost buried beneath them. Delphine LaLaurie herself has become less a woman and more a spectre, a symbol of wealth corrupted, a name synonymous with cruelty, remembered more for the legend than the person. Yet the truest legacy of the mansion belongs not to her, but to those whose voices were silenced within its walls. They are the ones whose suffering transformed an elegant home into a place of dread. Their memory gives the building its haunting power. Without them, it would be just another French Quarter house, stripped of meaning. With them, it becomes something eternal, a reminder, a warning, and a reckoning. The LaLaurie Mansion endures because it forces the world to remember what people would rather forget, that beneath luxury, behind locked doors, within the spaces society refuses to see, horror can grow unchecked until it burns its way into history. And so the house still stands, 3 stories of stone and shadow, timeless, waiting, demanding that we confront both the darkness of the past and the truths about ourselves that it reflects.